Without further ado, let me introduce our speaker. Trevor Branch is an associate professor of the School of Aquatic Fishery Science at the University of Washington. His researches focus on the sustainable management of fisheries and the conservation of whales, largely through computer modeling, data synthesis, meta-analysis, and reviews. This includes abundance estimates, trends, status evaluations, historical catch, allocation among population, distribution, aging, analysis of sex ratios, length of maturity, acoustic calls, migration, subspecies separation, and stock assessment. Key papers include assessing the current status of Antarctic blue whales, Chilean blue whales, Northeastern Pacific blue whales, and a large-scale synthesis of the distribution, movements, and subspecies separation of blue whales in the Southern Hemisphere and Northern Indian Ocean. His blue whale research includes 15 peer-reviewed papers on blue whales, 10 minor papers, and 29 unpublished papers presented to the scientific committee of International Whaling Commission. So I am very excited, and I'm really excited to introduce Trevor Branch to our meeting here at ACS. So thank you, and I will let you share your screen.
Hi, everybody. Thanks very much for this opportunity to speak about the coolest whale in the world. It may not be the most acrobatic whale or the most interesting whale when seen at sea, but they're definitely the coolest whale. And I'm going to give you a talk that starts with a glimmer of hope for Antarctic blue whales, the largest of them all. And then I'm going to move a little bit into some of the other populations of blue whales to give you a sense for where things are going in other places. I am on social media. I'm on Twitter. I run an account called @BlueWhaleNews, where I try and keep everybody up to date on the latest scientific papers, exclusively about blue whales, and I have a more general account that's just my name. So what do we know about blue whales? Well, we know that they're big, right? Everybody knows they're big. Did you know that they're obviously bigger than all the other whales? So they're bigger than fin whales and right whales and sperm whales and humpback whales. They're also the largest animal that ever lived. So they're bigger than any of the dinosaurs. They're bigger than African elephants, bigger than T-Rex, and so on and so forth. They're so big that the tongue of a blue whale is larger than an adult elephant. They're so big that their heart alone, which is what is in that huge big container, and yes, that is a 5-gallon bucket inside one of the valves of the heart. Their heart is so big that a toddler could swim through the artery that goes into the heart. So how do you know if you're out in the wild, if you're out on a boat, how do you know if you've seen a blue whale? What are the key distinguishing guides? Well, first of all, they have this kind of mottled gray skin. They're not actually blue. That's a misnomer. Their skin is sort of this mottled gray color. But they also have this incredibly tall blow. So here you can see this blow reaching up more than 18 feet, 6 meters. There's a drone above the whale there, flying around, circled around, that's trying to collect a little bit of blue whale blow to measure the various things they can measure in the blow, like the bacteria or the hormones or whatever they can measure. They also have a really, really small dorsal fin right at the back. So right near the tail, a tiny little dorsal fin. They don't have a really big dorsal fin. They have completely black baleen plates. So here's a blue whale that was taken in Saldanha Bay in South Africa at the height of apartheid. You can see the segregation of people on the bottom and on the top, telling you that's apartheid South Africa. And you can see the completely black baleen plates in the mouth. Underneath them, they're dark. So over here you can see 2 blue whales on the left and 1 fin whale on the right, being dragged along behind a whale catcher boat. And it's not that often you'll see the underside of a blue whale unless one is stranded, but that's a pretty diagnostic feature. And then finally, when they emerge from the water, they very, very seldom show their fins or flukes. So let me show you a sequence of images of a blue whale emerging, coming out, blowing. This blue whale is a bit stressed, so it's doing quite a large leap out of the water. There's the blowhole. If you look carefully at the blowhole itself, in a certain vein of light, looks just like an enormous human nostril, which is exactly what it is. The blue whale's going down, it's still going down, it's still going down. There's no sign of the dorsal fin, there's no sign of the flukes, and it's disappearing and it's gone. All right, so there's a sequence of the blue whale coming up and going down. Now, faced with this majestic whale, 20th century nations immediately asked the following question: how can we most efficiently kill them and turn them into margarine? And that was actually a major use for the whale, for blue whales, was literally margarine, a substitute for butter. In addition, whale oil was used for lubricants, for lighting, in the making of explosives, soap, fertilizer. There's a picture of a Canadian liquid whale plant food made from blue whale, liquid essence of the whale, used as fertilizer, as meat, and even to prevent gangrene in the trenches of World War I. Down the bottom right, you can see an ad from the agent, the US Bureau of Fisheries, Department of Commerce, now known as the National Marine Fisheries Service, part of NOAA, advertising as to all eat whale meat. This is meat, it's not fish, it's economical and excellent for soups, stews, curries, and roasts. And that's what happened when people realized that blue whales could be caught and killed and eaten. So let's take a step back and ask, what is the history of blue whales and human interactions with them? And most people know about the American whaling era, the sort of Moby Dick era, open ocean whaling with sailboats, and they went all over the earth. Every part of the globe there that has any dots in it, any bit of blue, is a noonday position of a whaling vessel in the Moby Dick era. All the dark blue dots are where they caught sperm whales, the red dots are where they caught right whales, the green dots are where they caught humpbacks, and the orange dots bowheads, and the pink dots gray whales. There's almost nowhere in the globe that was left untouched. But you'll notice that during this era, there were no catches of blue whales, fin whales, minke whales, or sei whales. And the reason for this is kind of interesting. It turns out that you can look at all the different whale species and divide them up into fight species and flight species. So the fight species are those that are generally slow moving, they're quite maneuverable, they fight back when they're in danger, when they're attacked by orcas, they'll fight back with their flippers and flukes. And those are the right whales, bowheads, the humpback whales, gray whales. They'll tend to hang out on the surface and do acrobatic things. And then there are the ones that are the flight species. Now the flight species are those that, when faced with danger, they turn around and swim as fast as they can away from them. Okay, and so the flight species are blue whales, fin whales, sei whales, and minke whales, and they're super fast swimming. There have been cases of a whale, a boat out looking for whales. They notice a whale behind them on the horizon. It swims past them, even though they're going at 20 miles an hour, and disappears over the horizon in front of them. So it's possible for these flight whales to swim at very fast, very sustained speeds. And it turned out that they could swim too fast to be targeted by the American whaling era, the Moby Dick era. And they could only be targeted by what is called modern whaling. So modern whaling started in the late 1800s and eventually featured a variety of innovations that allowed whalers to directly target blue whales and their kin. And the most important of these is the development of a factory ship. So here's an example of a factory ship with a stern slipway. So if you notice over here, there's a there's an area of the boat that's open to the elements with a ramp, and the whale could be hooked up and dragged onto the back of the boat for processing. Each of these factory boats was accompanied by up to 24 catcher vessels that were fast and powered by steam and diesel engines. So they could go much faster than a sailboat could in the Moby Dick era. And in combination with that, they developed explosive tipped harpoons, so you didn't have to be attached to the whale for hours, and air pumps to keep the whales afloat once they were harpooned. So all of these innovations resulted in a massive increase in the ability to catch whales such as blue whales. And what you see in this modern whaling era, this animation shows you how many whales were caught in different parts of the world. Started in the North Atlantic, Iceland, Greenland, and Norway. And then in the early 1900s, it spread to South Georgia and the South Shetlands. By the mid-1920s, the open pelagic era had started, where they could whale wherever they wanted with these stern slipways. World War II, all the boats got sunk, but it restarted pretty soon after World War II again. And then in the late 1950s, the Soviet Union started to ignore the regulations and whale almost everywhere in all the oceans. The moratorium on catching whales was in the 1980s. And since then, whales have largely only been caught in the Antarctic until recently, the US and Russia, in addition to Norway and Iceland. The net effect of this was that if you look just at the Southern Hemisphere, during the modern whaling era, these whalers targeted first humpback whales because they were the easiest to catch and the most valuable, and then blue whales because those were the biggest and most valuable. And then when those went down to low numbers, they targeted fin whales, which were a bit smaller and a bit less valuable. And when those went down, they switched to sperm whales and sei whales, which are even smaller. And when those declined, they switched to minke whales. And you'll notice a couple features here, World War I and World War II, there were big dips in catches. And finally, you'll notice that since the moratorium on whaling out here in 1986, the catches of all whales have been very small, even minke whales, which are now the big predominance of whales caught, comprise only a small proportion of what were caught in the 60s, 70s, and early 80s. Now, as the blue whale catches started declining, eventually the International Whaling Commission, which was tasked with managing whales around the world, started to take notice, and they formed a committee of 3 eminent scientists. These were independent scientists tasked with reporting back on the status of whale stocks. The report 2 years later was a bombshell, for the first time giving strong scientific evidence that whaling should be banned on different species, especially blue whales, which was finally implemented in 1966. And this committee of 3 consisted of the top people from New Zealand, Canada, and Australia. That was K. Radway Allen, who was the top person from all 3, managed all 3 at different times in his career, all the fisheries. Sidney Holt, who was a famous conservationist and fishery scientist, and Doug Chapman, who was the director of the School of Fisheries where I now work myself, a famous professor of mathematics. So full ban on whaling in 1966, full protection for blue whales. Did that help? Well, the answer was it didn't right away, because in the late 1950s, the Soviet Union was building the biggest fleet of factory ships ever produced, the largest boats with the largest fleets of catcher boats. Each of these factory ships would have 24 catcher vessels that would fan out in a line 200 miles broad, sweeping the ocean. And if any of those catcher boats found an aggregation of whales, they would converge on the whales, and the factory boat would come and mop up the whales. And at the time the ban was implemented, nobody was fully aware that what was really happening was that the Soviet Union was continuing to whale illegally. And here's a plot of where their catches were taken. The top panel is catches of all species, where the purple is more than 100 within a 1 degree square. And the bottom panel is how many of those catches were blue whales. And you'll see wherever there's color, they caught a lot of blue whales amongst the catches of all the other species. And during this time, 1958 to 1973, the Soviet Union was catching whales in complete contravention of all international law on forbidden species. They were catching humpbacks, right whales, blue whales. They were ignoring minimum length regulations. You weren't allowed to catch blue whales shorter than 70 feet. They were ignoring regulations on area. Everything north of that red line on the plots, north of 40 South, was illegal. You weren't allowed to conduct whaling north of 40 South. And they were ignoring even the whaling seasons. They were whaling both before and after the closed seasons for whales. And as a result, a massive number of catches of blue whales were taken during these years, well in excess of what would have been sustainable. So what happened? Let's take a look now at what we know about blue whales now. Okay, so first of all, we know that blue whales are structured. They're not all the same species. They're not all the same subspecies around the whole world. There are at least 4 distinct subspecies, those in the Northern Hemisphere, those in the Antarctic, what we call pygmy blue whales, which are largely in the Indian Ocean, and then somewhat more controversially, Chilean blue whales, which I argue are a separate subspecies. So let's go and look first at the biggest and the best of them all, the Antarctic blue whale. Antarctic blue whales have the biggest individuals of any population of blue whale. And before whaling started, they were also by far the most numerous of all of the populations and subspecies of blue whales. So how many are left now? Well, it turns out that the IWC went and conducted a bunch of surveys around the Antarctic, where all the Antarctic blue whales go in the summer. So south of about 60 South, they all go down there and feed on krill all summer long. And this 30-year-long set of surveys resulted in 3 abundance estimates for the entire circumpolar area. Remember, the Antarctic continent is a huge continent, so this is a bit like doing a survey all the way around South America or a survey all the way around North America. And the result of this was 3 abundance estimates. Just 450 in 1981, 559 in 1988, and 2,280 in the mid-year of 1998. And from these and from the historical catches, we can reconstruct how many blue whales there were every year, and how many were caught every year, and what proportion were caught every year. And so this is one of the pieces of work that I did many years ago. So what you see here is this is the fraction of all the Antarctic blue whales that were caught every year. And what you see is any point there that is above the dashed gray line is an unsustainable catch. So in every year from the late 1920s to 1973, catches were unsustainable for blue whales, and very often many times above any sustainable level that would be there. And you can see the dip in World War II when catches plummeted, all the boats were sunk. You can see the period after the moratorium in 1966 when catches remained well above sustainable levels. And you can see finally the introduction of international observers in 1973 on board the Soviet vessels that stopped the illegal whaling from the Soviet Union. The very last blue whale was caught in 1978 anywhere in the world, and that was caught by Spain, of all places. We can also reconstruct what the trend is in blue whale numbers over time. And this is possibly the most tragic plot you'll ever see for any species of cetacean, except perhaps the vaquita in recent years. They started at 239,000 blue whales. And by the time the international observers were introduced to the Soviet vessels, they had dropped to just 360. Not 360,000, 360 individual whales. Fewer than there are North Atlantic right whales now. They'd been depleted to just 0.15% of their original pre-whaling numbers. Now, something that's always puzzled me about this is, why was it that the whalers could continue going after blue whales when it really shouldn't have been profitable? With just 360 whales left and a massive whaling fleet, how is it profitable for them to continue catching blue whales? Surely they were so spread out that it would have been prohibitively expensive to go and search for blue whales everywhere in the world and find the last few. And the answer is that they weren't actually looking for blue whales. But during this period when the blue whale catches were down at low levels, so you can see the blue whale catches here are in blue, you can see the numbers were declining to very, very low levels. But during this period, the whalers were not targeting blue whales. The whalers were targeting fin whales. And if they happened to find a blue whale on the side, they would catch it too, because blue whales are more valuable than fin whales. And they were catching sperm whales, and they were catching humpback whales. And later they were catching sei whales and minke whales once all of these species had gone down to low levels. So I call this opportunistic exploitation. And it turns out that this kind of pattern is quite prevalent in all sorts of human exploitation. So for example, in Zambia, when poachers were targeting rhinos, they had almost completely wiped out the rhinos, and they just switched to targeting elephants. But if they saw a rhino, they would take the rhino because they were more valuable. Or the Babirusa wild pigs are caught as a sideline to a much more common type of wild pig that's not endangered. Or fisheries for sea cucumbers, where the most valuable sea cucumbers go down to low levels, but there are other sea cucumber species that can sustain fisheries, while the valuable ones get taken whenever they're encountered. Or mahogany trees in the Amazon, where the first sweep will take out most of the mahogany trees, but then they'll go back and look for other trees that are also valuable, not quite as valuable, and take out the mahogany that they encounter as they're looking for the other tree species. So this kind of mode of opportunistic exploitation turns out to be quite widespread, and to explain to a large extent why it was economically feasible to continue targeting blue whales, even though blue whales by themselves were not a very valuable resource because there were so few of them. So what's happening now? That was a sort of a history lesson of the death and destruction of Antarctic blue whales. What happens if we go and look in at the current trends, the sort of little blip down the bottom over there? What's happening now? And here we have some good news. It turns out that since whaling ended, the blue whales do seem to have been recovering. I show the main 3 abundance estimates here, but there are some other trends we can get from other data that also show increasing trends. And these trends seem to have continued through to the present. They're going up at about 7 to 8% a year. And the latest abundance estimate, which is still a preliminary one based on photo mark recaptures by Paula Olsen, is about 4,500 in the early 2000s. So it seems like this trend has been continuing. So this is some great news. Now, when I presented these results to the IWC, there was some skepticism. People thought, well, how do you know? Can you guarantee that these are really increases in Antarctic blue whales? And so I had to go and do a bunch of follow-up projects to ask questions like, well, is there any long-term harm to the population from, say, catches that might be targeting one sex versus the other sex? Now, this is kind of an interesting study we just published now. It shows that over time, the proportion of males in the Antarctic catches just slightly more than 50-50, so slightly more than 50% males in the catches, and then over time, slightly less than 50%. So it's a bit of a preponderance of females caught over here. And you can see this pattern if you look at it spatially as well. Areas that look mostly blue are where there were more whales caught. And you can see over time, before World War II, after World War II, those colors shift from slightly blue to slightly red throughout the area. And we don't have a good explanation for this. If the whalers were targeting all the big whales, you would expect the females to be in trouble and to start dwindling and to catch fewer females over time. But surprisingly, we found a slight trend towards catching more females over time. And so we don't think there's any impact of the whaling on the sex structure of Antarctic blue whales. But a more serious objection was raised was this. What if this Antarctic blue whale increase is not Antarctic blue whales increasing, it's just pygmy blue whales moving south into the areas of the survey? So if you don't know the difference between the two, Antarctic blue whales are really big and pygmy blue whales are really, really small. They're only about 80 feet, sexually matured about 63 feet. They're about the size of a massive fin whale, all right? So where do we find pygmy blue whales? Well, they're in this area in the Indian Ocean that is quite close to where you see the Antarctic blue whales in blue. And so it's entirely feasible that they could have shifted down south. So here are some plots of where we find pygmy blue whales. These are the massive Japanese scouting data set. On the top is areas of effort, where each square that's purple has 5,000 kilometers of search effort. And down the bottom, you can see how many blue whales were seen per 1,000 kilometers of search effort. And you can see this big patch where there are where there are pygmy blue whales over here, and then the scattered points over here are isolated Antarctic blue whale sightings. And it turns out that when you go and look at all of the past and present catches, sightings, and so on, there's been no real place where Antarctic blue whales disappeared. They're always present everywhere they were present, and the sightings of pygmy blue whales seem to be present where they used to be present as well. I should say one of the things about doing this compilation that was kind of interesting was identifying this little trend over here, that it seems like the Australian blue whales migrate up to Indonesia. No one had fully made that connection before the paper that we did. And I was super pleased to see a few years later when they actually put some satellite tracks on showing multiple blue whales following this exact pathway we found in our paper. It was really cool to see that. So this comes back to the question, how do we know that the whales we see in the Antarctic are not pygmy blue whales? And it turns out you can use the idea of a mixture model to figure this out. So the idea here is that if all of the whales that you saw in the catches were Antarctic blue whales, you'd see one peak over here at the lengths of Antarctic blue whales. If they're all pygmy, you'd see one peak over here where the pygmy lengths are. And if they're 50-50, you'd see kind of a bimodal distribution with two peaks. And so you can go and look at the actual lengths of blue whales from the catches and see if you see this bimodal peak as time changed and the numbers of blue whales went down. And the answer is you don't at all. So the answer is that pygmy blue whales in the Indian Ocean consistently stay at shorter lengths, and the Antarctic blue whales caught in the Antarctic region consistently stay large without any evidence of a little peak down here. So you can analyze these data and get an estimate that only 0.8% of Antarctic whales could have been pygmy blue whales. Incidentally, there's kind of an interesting quirk to these data. All these yellow lines here show a sudden peak in the more whales being recorded at these lengths. And it turns out that's just a pure rounding error. It turns out that lots of whalers could only bother to record their whales to the nearest 5-foot interval. And so there's a peak at 75 feet, 80 feet, and 85 feet in the data. Now we can also attack this problem in another way, and I excuse the gory picture. This is a picture of two ovaries from a blue whale. And you can see over here, this big lump over here in the ovary. This is called a corpus luteum. And this lump forms to produce hormones during pregnancy. When the pregnancy is over, the lump gets smaller. And over time, it gets smaller and smaller and smaller, but the lumps are still visible. Each of these lumps is one corpus, one ovarian corpora, that corpora lutea that could be used as a measure of how many pregnancies the whale has had. So I was able to get some data from the illegal Soviet logbooks and record how many of these were present in each of the whales that were caught by length. And what you see is in the Antarctic region, they only start being pregnant above about 75 feet. And then all of a sudden you start getting whales that were pregnant that have lots of corpora. In the pygmy area, you can see they start getting pregnant at about 60 feet and then rapidly rise up. And there's very little evidence over here at these shorter lengths of any pygmy blue whales. And a model fitted to these data suggests that anywhere from 0 to 0.4% of the whales in the Antarctic were pygmy blue whales. So we can essentially discard this idea that the whales we see in the surveys are pygmy blue whales. So what about some of the other areas? Well, what about Chile? When I did the exercise of what size the whales are, it turned out the Chilean blue whales didn't fit either the Antarctic distribution or the pygmy distribution. And they weren't bimodal, so it wasn't like they were a mixture of the two. And when we consider that these lengths, in addition to them having a unique song type, one of 10 song types, being genetically distinct from pygmy and Antarctic blue whales, being geographically separate from them, having lengths that are intermediate, all these point towards the possibility that Chilean blue whales are a separate subspecies. And we were lucky enough to uncover some long buried data about how big the tails are of Chilean blue whales, and to be able to compare those to pygmy blue whales and Antarctic blue whales. And what we find is that the Chilean blue whales seem to be fairly similar to Antarctic. So here the Chilean blue whales are blue, Antarctic are the background crosses, and the pygmy blue whales are the red points. And what you see is when you plot that tail length on the y-axis against the length from the tip of the snout to the eye, you see that they do seem to separate out from pygmy blue whales. So they certainly don't fit in the pygmy blue whale area. So how are pygmy blue whales, how are Chilean blue whales doing? Well, the latest abundance estimate show that there's a minimum of at least 570 to 760 animals there. And the catches, they were much smaller than in the Antarctic. And so we don't know exactly what the status is because we only have a minimum abundance estimate, but they're probably above 25% of pre-whaling levels. How about the whales off our coast? What's the status of Northeast Pacific blue whales, the ones you see off Monterey Bay right now? They're the Northeast Pacific population. On this map, they're the NEPO ones. And the hardest part of assessing the status of this population is we don't quite know whether which catches were taken from this population and which catches were taken from the Western and Central population, also in the North Pacific. But it turns out that we have acoustic data that separates these two populations. They make unique songs. So everywhere you see a blue point here is the song type of the Northeast Pacific population. Everywhere you see a red circle or point here, it's the Central and Western population. And where both are present, there's some overlap in the songs. So that both populations might inhabit the areas in the Gulf of Alaska, for example. And you can fit a model to these data and get a nice surface and use those to separate out all the historical catches. So here, all the points that are dark blue are definitely Northeast Pacific. Those dark red are definitely the Western and Central. And those ones that are kind of in the middle are in a faded color. And then you can apply those to historical catch series and figure out how many were caught from the population of California. And that turns out to be surprisingly much smaller than we thought it would be. Only 3,400. Compare that to the 350,000 caught in the Antarctic, or even the 7,000 caught off Chile. Once we have the catches and we do have nice abundance estimates, we can fit the same kinds of models to it. And the good news is that off California, our blue whales seem to have mostly recovered up to the pre-whaling levels. Now, there are still some issues here. We worry about ship strikes. We worry that they're not increasing as fast as the Antarctic blue whales are increasing, but it seems like they have recovered to close to pre-whaling levels. So where else can we figure out what the status is of blue whale populations? Let's go and delve into the most difficult area of them all. This is the pygmy blue whale area, where there's not just one population you're worried about, or two populations like in the North Pacific. There are as many as 5. There's one down by Madagascar, the Southwest Indian Ocean. There's one in the Central Indian Ocean. There's a new one we think that occurs off Oman in the northwest Indian Ocean. There's the Australia-Indonesia population, the Southeast Indian Ocean, and then there are the ones off New Zealand. And each of these has a unique song that's completely unique to that population. We use those to separate out the populations. Now, we don't have good data for all of them, but we do have the most amazing set of long-term hydrophones. These are underwater microphones that have been deployed and collected to produce years and years of data on the song types produced by different whale populations. And here are 4 of those 5 populations. You can see where the North Indian Ocean call is heard, where the Southeast Indian Ocean population is heard, where the ones off Madagascar are heard, and where the ones off New Zealand are heard. And the nice thing about this is you have both where they are heard and where they're not heard. And so you can fit the same kind of nice spatial smoothing models to these to get some idea where these populations might occur. Now, these data, just when you think you know what's going on, these data don't include that 5th population off Oman, and it turns out that we'll need to adjust these for next year to figure out where they really occur, because that North Indian Ocean population turns out to be separated into 2 now, not just 1. But the idea is once you have these spatial smooth models, you can apply those to the historical catches in these areas and figure out how many most likely were caught of each of these populations. And it turns out this population down in the southwest had by far the biggest catches taken, followed by the one off Australia, whereas the ones in New Zealand were only lightly affected by whaling, and those in the North Indian Ocean at an intermediate level. So given all this, we can now piece together what the status is of many populations around the world. Some are still unknown, but some are known. Here's a summary. I'm not going to go through all of them. The good news story is Antarctic blue whales are increasing, but still at low levels. That California blue whales are almost back to pre-exploitation levels. That New Zealand blue whales are probably not too depleted. That the Madagascar and Australian populations are likely fairly depleted, as are the Central and Western Pacific populations, and for sure the North Atlantic population too, where there were quite serious catches. But we really know very little about that new Northwest Indian Ocean status. So there's my summary. I have everything about blue whales in it. I have lots more stuff that I can tell you if you ask me questions at the end. I'd like to thank numerous co-authors I've worked with, particularly Kate Stafford and Anna Servich, Cherry Allison, Daniel Palacios, Rob Williams, Cole Monahan, Luis Pastini, and Jorge Acevedo. All of this work was funded in various bits and pieces by the International Whaling Commission, and I'm grateful for the funding. And I'm open to answer any questions that people have. Thanks very much for your time and attention.
Thank you so much, Trevor. That was amazing. Just a lot of data and a lot of interesting things that, here for us, with our blue whales to learn about the other populations. That was just amazing. So thank you so much for that. So we're just like what he says, we're open for any questions. I think one of the best ways that we've been noticing so far with large meetings like this is feel free to put it into the comments at the on the bottom of your screen. So hit that chat function and then put in your questions. There's already been a couple questions that have been, been asked for you. So this one was from Ramona and it was answered by Alan, but maybe you have some extra things that you want to say about it. So how did scientists get the data on the Soviet whaling activities if it has done illegally? Alan said that they kept 2 sets of book and one of your guys knew a Russian who showed him. So maybe you can elaborate on this.
Yeah, this is a truly astonishing story. In 1994, when glasnost perestroika, the Soviet Union was crumbling and they were becoming open about all kinds of things, a Russian scientist came to the biannual meeting of the Marine Mammals Society and stood up at a keynote presentation and said, by the way, we lied about everything, and here's what we truly caught, and this is where we truly caught it. And although some of the original data has been lost, some of the scientists kept the original logbook data, the ones I had access to, which contains information about individual whale catches, in their backyard all those years since whaling ended. And when they came open about it, they released all the data to the International Whaling Commission, who were able to piece together, I would say 99% of all of the catches that were taken. Not all of them have individual data. Some, about 80% have individual data, about 20% were lost. And so these books and logbooks, I was sent a big pile of them to extract the data about the corpora for that analysis. And boy, it's hard to look through page after page after page where every line is an illegal catch of a whale. It takes its toll on you to go through and think about whale after whale after whale, page after page, until you've gone through a stack that's 12 inches high of paper.
Wow. Thank you. So the next question that I have is from Hao Chen Lee. He says, how do the two species of blue whales have reproductive isolation? This is when you were talking about the pygmies and the Antarctic population.
Well, they're not actually necessarily reproductively isolated, and we don't quite know what the story is. I mean, if you say they're subspecies, that means they can still reproduce together. They can still interbreed. It's only when they become species that you expect them not to interbreed very much. Although fin whales and blue whales can hybridize and produce viable offspring. So all of these large species of whales, to some extent, must have some ability to hybridize. But what we think is happening is that the unique song types are what keep them apart. So it seems like every population has a unique song, and that's what they use to identify their own kind, as it were. So that's what that's the mechanism.
Amelia says, how do you validate your models?
That's a good question. So what we're doing in our models is we're just trying to explain the data that are available the best way we can. And so for the model I showed you, I simplified it down quite a bit. I only showed fitting to 3 data points for the Antarctic, for example. But actually what we have for the Antarctic is we have 3 separate time series of data. We have 2 other sets of data from Japanese sighting vessels and surveys that they did that also show similar trends. And so you try and fit a model that is the best fit to all of those 3 data sets and explains the catches and doesn't go extinct, which is often the hardest part with a model like that, where they go down to such low levels. It's very hard to find any plausible trajectory of whale numbers that doesn't go extinct. When you go from very high numbers to very low numbers and then increase again. And so for these models, I used what are called Bayesian models, which allow you to take in all the information about biological parameters, rates of increase, survival, and so on, and include those in the models in addition to what we think are reasonable rates of increase for other whale populations where we've observed them for many years. So it's kind of an all-inclusive model, that a bit like a weather forecasting model. When you do a weather forecast, you take in all the data you can from all the weather stations around the country, and then you have some model that tries to predict those the best you can and forecast into the future. And so that's kind of what we're doing here.
I have a question from earlier in the chat, and it says, what is the oldest recorded blue whale?
That's a little tricky. Some people say 110 years, but that number is really just an inference from the ovarian corpora. They're assuming that they put down one every 2.5 years. But if they get pregnant every 2 years, then it would be an underestimate. You can age them from their earwax. So you can take an earplug out of the inner ear of a blue whale and they're about 30 centimeters long, and you count the rings, and that's the best way of aging them. And the oldest one aged that way is, I believe, 80 to 90 years, somewhere in that range.
Wow, earwax.
Earwax for the win.
Earwax.
Yeah.
I've heard that about fin whales, and so I was like curious to know that they can also do that with blue whales. That's awesome. Jim Scarf asks, do you have any comments on the recent increase of sightings off Tristan da Cunha in South America, or in the South Atlantic?
Well, there are quite a few places in that area where blue whales do occur. The Canary Islands is a favorite place, and I believe that's, my geography might be completely wrong, but I believe that's not too far away from Tristan da Cunha. Might be completely wrong though. Oh wait, the South Atlantic. I'm not sure about that. I obviously have my geography wrong.
Yeah, I don't know where that is, so let's see.
I have to do a quick Google search and look for where Tristan da Cunha is.
It looks like it's off of, nope, Volcanic Wildlife Reserve. Wow, right snap, like off of, right in the middle of the South Atlantic. So pretty much between, I would say, Brazil and South Africa.
Oh, I don't know. That's fascinating. I wasn't aware of recent sightings there. That's really, really cool. That's an area where I've always hypothesized the Antarctic blue whales would go in winter, but there are no surveys that have been done there. And in the past, when there were hundreds of thousands of Antarctic blue whales, you would think that you would have seen a lot of them there in winter. But we really just don't know where any large concentrations of Antarctic blue whales go in winter. I think they go off the west coast of Africa, but they do also seem to be detected by song all throughout the Southern Hemisphere. So it's like they just scatter, which kind of makes sense if you're avoiding predators and everything. You scatter when you're not feeding, and you can always find a mate by just calling really loudly, and they haven't been being heard hundreds of miles away. And once you mate, you scatter again, and so there's no concentration for predators or whalers to target.
So Anne Chadwick asks, are the acoustic techniques those developed by Roger Payne? Wasn't that in the 1970s? Yeah,
some of the pioneering work was done by Roger Payne. And there was that classic best-selling long-playing album of just humpback whale songs. Now, humpback whales are much more interesting in terms of their songs than blue whales. Humpbacks have these long, almost like pop songs that change from year to year, and they can be passed on from one population to another and gradually spread from west to east. Blue whales are super boring. They just go the same song, bong bong, bong bong, bong bong, for like 30 years. They don't change their sound. They get a little bit lower over time, and we don't know why. But if you're looking for an interesting song, humpbacks are really cool. And even more cool are bowhead whales that are like the jazz singers of the whale world. They can change their song from individual to individual, from year to year, and be just completely remarkable in their repertoire.
Wow, I didn't know. So yeah, okay, I can ask that question. Yeah, I can ask that my own question later. Do blue whales travel solo or in groups? Do they have different dialects? What do you mean by song?
Oh, I've got the greatest blue whale shirt. I should have worn that for my talk. Blue whales largely travel solo. And so they're the ideal poster child for COVID. They keep their isolation. The only time you see blue whales together is when it's a mother accompanied by the calf, and the calves wean at about 7 months old, and then they split up. And the other time you might see them in groups is a female that is being chased by 1 or 2 males wanting some action. And so then you'll see a group of 2 or 3. Sometimes if the if the feeding is good, and you see this off Monterey Bay, if there's really good krill concentrations, the blue whales will start to aggregate up because they're all there to feed in the same place. And so you might see quite a few blue whales in the same area if the feeding is good. But when they travel, they're pretty much socially isolating animals, which is why they don't get COVID.
So solo animals. Let's see. Do you have specific details on the threat that commercial fishing poses to whales, or as a whole, or particular types such as bycatch or through ghost fishing?
Well, that's certainly a concern for some species of whales. Everybody knows the North Atlantic right whales and the concern there from being entangled in crab pots from the lines and the buoys from crab pots. And that's true of most whale species. There's always a possibility of being entangled in fishing gear. And sometimes that poses a big threat. It's not such a big threat to blue whales as a sort of proportional threat. A bigger threat is ship strikes, being hit by ships that are just traveling. And those are largely container vessels. And especially in areas like off California, where there are lots of blue whales close to shore in the middle of very busy shipping lanes. So for some species, yes, North Atlantic right whales are a huge concern. And there's some very expensive work being done on changing how crab pots are attached to buoys. If you make the lines have a lower strength, they'll break more easily when a whale gets entangled. Or you can have pots that don't even have a line attached to them that just get released by a remote point. But all those solutions cost money, and it's a question of how much do you want to spend to save the whales.
So this question is asking about, is there a breeding population in Sri Lanka or near Sri Lanka and India?
Yes, there is. It's really cool. Some of the best blue whale watching in the world is off Sri Lanka. In fact, if someone's asking me, where would I go to see blue whales? I would say, well, either go off California in summer or go off Sri Lanka. Anytime the weather is calm, there are resident whales off Sri Lanka all year round in predictable areas quite close to shore. And it seems like they must be breeding up there. Although the songs we hear off Sri Lanka, we also hear in the central Indian Ocean, and you even hear it quite far south of the equator. So it seems like that central portion of the Indian Ocean, some of them might migrate north and south from that population.
So, talking about your different, the different populations, Patricia's asking, do different blue whale populations have different cultures or ecotypes, such as, humpbacks or even killer whales or orcas?
I think that's one of the true unknowns. With orcas, it's mostly the ecotypes are, well, these ones target fish, and these ones target seals, and these ones might target, sharks and skates. With blue whales, they're just opening their mouth and catching krill, okay? And it turns out they catch whatever is the most abundant, most dense aggregating zooplankton. So nearly always that's a species of krill. Off Sri Lanka, I think they are also targeting, trying to remember what species, what it is. I want to say copepods, but I might be wrong. And around the world, in some places they target one species of krill, some places they target another species of krill. It just depends whatever's most abundant, but they're very, very krill specific. They don't catch fish or anything like that. In terms of culture, well, boy, we don't know, that's hard to say what you mean by culture. They're making these super boring calls, so we don't think there's any wonderful language that they're imparting between themselves. We know there are differences, and they do seem to be separate into populations, but what that means for culture, it's hard to say. Somebody will find out.
Yeah, yeah. Since technology is growing, we'll figure it out. Drew asked, since it seems like the international observers make a big difference, do you know if they had any pushbacks, both being required and as individuals doing the job? Do we still require them, and for what? I don't know.
They are required by international law, but ever since the moratorium on catching whales in 1986, that's been a kind of a moot point. Everybody that's still fishing is doing it under objection to international law, or doing it as scientific whaling, or doing it as Aboriginal whaling, like we have in the US, where we're catching lots of whales up in Alaska every year, and those don't have observers. Those don't have international observers. So if commercial whaling was to resume, they would be required. When there were international observers, yes, there was a lot of pushback from the Soviet Union. From the 1950s to the 1970s, every year there was a proposal to have international observers on board, and every year Russia and a couple other nations objected, and it didn't get implemented as law. So it took all those years until 1973 before it was finally required. In terms of individuals doing the job, well, you have to remember that any observer on a whaling boat is sitting on that boat for probably 4 months in a culture where everybody is from a different country. You may or may not speak the language as well. And if you report some infraction, you might get hostile reactions for the next 3 months of your life. So it's always a little bit tricky with these observers on any vessel. The most common thing we see in observers on whaling vessels is when they caught a whale that was under the legal length of 70 feet, like 68 feet, the observers would often record that whale as being exactly 70 feet. And so when you look at the distribution of how many whales are caught at every length, there's a big gap of whales caught at 67, 68, 69 feet, and a big peak at 70 feet. So we call that whale stretching. So there definitely was some influence of observers being pressured one way or the other to not record infractions.
So for right now, it's 8:31. Is there, there's a handful more questions for you, Trevor. Yep. Would you like to just pick out a handful and then call it a day, and then maybe we can get, some contact information. So if anyone wants to get in contact with you through social media or anything, they can. There are a handful of questions that maybe you feel like you want to point out.
Okay, let me scan through the questions. I don't have any audio. I do have audio, but it would be a little difficult for me to play them now. You can actually just Google Antarctic blue whale song on YouTube, and there are a few songs. They have to be sped up because the actual sound is so deep that you can't hear it. It just is like a rumbling, like an earthquake sound. Has anyone started to photo ID blue whales? Yes, there are large photo ID catalogs, and the final estimate for Antarctic blue whales includes the photo ID data they use it as a mark recapture estimate. So you can figure out how many blue whales there are based on how many whales you have photos for, and if you go back next year, how many blue whales do you sight again for the second time? If you sight them all again, then you've probably got photos of the whole population. If you sight almost none of them, the population is probably quite big. And we use those for Chile, New Zealand, off the west coast of the US. They're big photo catalogs that are used for abundance estimates. Does sound pollution affect blue whales? That is really hard to judge. We don't know. They communicate over hundreds of miles, possibly. And there's sounds in all blue whale populations have been getting deeper over time, but there's no good explanation for why that is so, or whether it affects reproduction behavior. It seems likely that it does not, given that most populations are increasing though. So there's a question from Dan. Since they went down to just 320 blue whales, isn't there a lot of interbreeding? And this is kind of fascinating. I would expect that all be severely inbred and in trouble. But it turns out that when you go to the Antarctic population and you get little skin biopsies and you do the genetics on that, it turns out that there's a lot of genetic variability still in the population. And so it seems like the shock of whaling was over a relatively short period of time. And although they certainly lost quite a bit of genetic variability, the ones that remain are still quite diverse. So it doesn't seem for the moment like that's an issue. There's a question about work being done to have cargo ships slow down and emit a noise to help whales move out of the way in time. Yes, there is an effort to slow the ships down, and that should help the whales get out of the way. I don't think that emitting a noise will be a good warning. I don't think whales really respond to noise in that way to move out of the way in time. But one thing you could do is have a system where you're listening for whale sounds. If there are whale sounds in the area, you could alert the ships to slow down because we think there are whales in the area. And they're doing that fairly successfully for North Atlantic right whales. There's a great question here from Kathleen. How far can their vocalizations travel? Are they distinct or identifiable to other blue whales? Why do they vocalize? So this is kind of an interesting story because it turns out there are two types of calls they make. The one call is the boring call I'm using to separate the populations out, where they just go bong, 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 hour after hour after hour. And that call must have some kind of mating function because only the males are thought to make those calls. You could say it's a form of mansplaining. Okay. It's just the males making the same boring sound all the time until the females get bored of them and succumb. The other sounds they make are thought to be feeding sounds, the D calls and so on. And those are quite variable. And maybe those are used to identify individual blue whales to each other. It's not clear why they call when they're feeding. Perhaps they're alerting other blue whales that there is good food. It's not really clear why they make those calls. So the answer is we think that there's a mating function for the song type, but we don't know why they make the calls when they're feeding. And yes, Patricia, each group has a different song type that's quite distinct. Actually, I wonder if I can show you what they look like on a spectrogram. So if you look here, these are really loud blue whale calls. And what you're seeing here is on the x-axis is the time. So each of these sequences is 450 seconds. So each of these sequences is 7 minutes. So this call here, for example, is a 2-minute long call, and there's a 2-minute long call over here. And you can see this call being made here, then this one, then this one. And each of these has quite distinct frequency bands that they specialize in and a quite distinct call. Here's the Antarctic call. That's the bong, 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 bong sound. And you see in the space of 450 seconds, they've made 7 calls, but the Southeast Indian Ocean population's only made 2 calls, and the North Indian Ocean population has made 3 calls. And each of these is very distinctive. Now, some of these have a lot of sound up at very high frequencies, 100 hertz, and this one's down at 20 hertz. So there's quite a big difference between these. They're quite distinct. There's a question about if acidification caused to the ocean through ocean trawling would necessarily have a significant impact to whales' food accessibility. So just to clarify those 2 points, so the ocean acidification is caused by us adding carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. It gets sucked up by the oceans, just like carbon dioxide in your fizzy soda is acidic and dissolves teeth. In the same way, when the oceans suck up carbon dioxide, they become more acidic. They're not actually acidic. They're not actually on the acid scale. They're still on the base scale. but that could have an impact on krill. I haven't seen convincing evidence that that would cause a major reduction in their prey yet, but it's certainly a concern that it could happen. Then separately, what about ocean trawling? Would that have a significant impact on whale food accessibility? There aren't big fisheries on the krill that whales need. There are krill fisheries mainly off the Antarctic Peninsula, but they're relatively small compared to the number of krill that are there, of the order of 1% per year. And you can't do a krill fishery off California because it's not allowed at present. Is it true Japan is whaling and using it for dog food? They are whaling, but they use it for human consumption, largely. If you go to any supermarket in Japan, there'll be big whale steaks available, and they're catching minke whales. And as of this year, they're only catching minke whales off Japan itself. They're no longer whaling in the Antarctic. Boy, there's so many good questions here. Are blue whales keystone species? And if so, please explain. So for those that don't know what a keystone species is, this is something that is absolutely central to an ocean ecosystem of any type. So the classic case is if you remove a big starfish, the Pysasta starfish, then those stop eating all the mussels, and the mussel and those were eating all the mussels. So the mussel beds come back and take over the shore, and then the starfish can't get back into that area, and so it causes a permanent shift. Are blue whales keystone species? They do have impacts in a lot of different ways, but I don't think that they are absolutely central to ocean ecosystems. They have impacts through fertilization, through their excretion. They have impacts on what they eat. Presumably they eat quite a lot of krill, and that would reduce the amount of krill available to other species. They're occasionally the targets of orcas for predation, but very, very rarely. So I would say that they're iconic, but perhaps not keystone species. Someone asked, is anyone studying whale? Patricia asked, is anyone studying whale poop for hormones, toxicants, etc.? And the answer is yes. There have been some studies looking at hormones in blue whale poop. And what you have to know that's really cool about blue whale poop is it's bright orange. Alan G, this is a good question. Can you expand on whale poop value in absorbing greenhouse gases? So this is a little complicated to explain. As I understand it, when whales eat krill, they're eating things that have carbon in them, because all living animals and plants have carbon as their basis. Every cell is made up of carbon in various ways. And so when they poop out, two things happen. One thing is it could sink down to the ocean bottom and just stay there forever, and that would remove some carbon dioxide. The other thing that can happen is that it acts as a fertilizer that promotes the growth of various phytoplankton, sort of ocean little plants that float around. And those would take up carbon dioxide and then potentially sink to the ocean bottom. So both those aspects can help with reducing greenhouse gases. But I think in the grand scheme of things, whale poop alone is not going to save us. We actually need to reduce the amount of carbon dioxide we put into the atmosphere. What's the length of gestation for a blue whale? It is about 11 months long. How does this compare to other whale species? It's about the same for all of the baleen whales, but sperm whales have I think a 22-month long gestation period, which is super, super long. What about ads selling krill for people? It is a big food source for whales, but the amount of krill being caught is relatively small compared to what's out there. So to put it into perspective, every year the krill population has about 1/3 to 1/2 added to it, just from natural births, and the catches are never more than about 1%. For comparison, when we go fishing, commercial fisheries will often catch 5 to 10% of the fish that are out there, and then 5 or 10% get added every year through births. So krill fishing is much less of an impact than regular fisheries on fish species.
Okay, with that, I have to say thank you, Trevor, so much for joining us for this month's ACS meeting. I'm really excited, and I've learned a lot about blue whales, especially the Antarctic species, because they are the best and the largest. So that's amazing. So thank you so much for that. You are now going to be a member for ACS. So that's your reward for becoming one of us and talking about your research. So thank you so much for that. We'll get in contact with you so that you can sign up, and we have some monthly kind of papers and newsletter that comes out. So you're now going to be a honorary ACS member. So thank you so much for that.
Thank you.
Keep up with such great information. For everyone, thank you for joining us. Sign up for our newsletters, as well as our emails online, so that you can learn more about what our next presentation is going to be. We'll see everyone in January, and I hope everyone has a great holiday. Stay safe, everyone. And thank you so much, Trevor. And of course, follow him on Twitter. That's super excited. I just found him myself, and now I'm going to follow him, Blue Whale News. So if you folks are on Twitter, definitely get on and follow Trevor at Blue Whale News. Super exciting. So thank you so much, everyone, and have a great day.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks for all the fabulous questions. I really appreciate the opportunity to chat about my favorite topic, blue whales.
Awesome. Bye, everyone. Have a great night.